Hello, I'm Rajnish.
And I'm Brigid,
Welcome to TerreScience.
the podcast where reality matters. So, welcome back. Please like and subscribe if you guys enjoy our podcast. We have some wonderful guests, and we really hope that you guys enjoy these episodes where it's also just me and Raj talking. So, please share this with anybody that you think might be interested as well.
Thanks, Bridget. So today we're going to talk about consciousness. Why and what made us aware of ourselves? That's one way to describe consciousness. So, Bridget, what do you think consciousness is, and what is conscious?
So I feel that my understanding of consciousness continues to develop as I talk to you and some of our guests, and just my own experiences with it too. I think I'm starting to understand that there's all of these different ways to describe what consciousness is and the different levels. We just had a great conversation in our last episode with Bruce McIver, where we got into how anesthesia really is part of when you're under anesthesia, you're in a very low consciousness. But then there's also like the sleep where you're unconscious, but you can be aroused into a higher level of consciousness. And there's like the general being awake and aware. And from there, there's even higher levels of consciousness where you can basically be more in tune with your environment, or more in tune of yourself and perceptions and all of that. So I think like I'm trying to understand all of these different aspects, because it's not like consciousness is one thing, it is a lot of different things. And I guess when you're thinking about who is conscious, I
Mhm.
probably don't have all of the answers to that, but I like, in my own opinion, I think it's not just humans. It is animals. It is the other living beings that are around us. I know
Including plants.
you think of plants, yes. So in a different way than us, but they have their own type of consciousness. So that, at least that's my understanding. But I don't understand how consciousness in this sense relates to things like the beginning of the universe. So that's where you can come into play.
Well, nobody really understands or knows that, and so
Yeah.
there are many, many theories, and just like many other people, I have a theory as well, and so I can, we can talk about a little bit
Yeah.
about what that theory is. So again, this is a theory, what we are going to discuss here, and it's sometimes these things are very hard to study. One of the things that has been done a lot is mathematics and physics has played a very big role in understanding advancing our understanding of the universe, and also now towards consciousness. One of the challenges, I think describing a physical thing like the universe is easy with mathematics, but it's very hard when you come to what is color blue. So mathematician or physicist will, or even I as a photobiologist will tell you it's this wavelength, but how it makes you feel, no one can tell that. How can I tell you how the color blue makes me feel? And that's a perception of color blue, and then everything that I've learned about it and associate with it in myself, inside me. And you may do it in different ways. That's what we talk about as consciousness, is becoming aware of your environment, and understanding it in your own perspective. So how where did it come from? So there are two different ways that I think that I have come across that I like in how the universe started. So, we know that Big Bang occurred about 13.7 billion years ago. That's when the universe started. And within 10 to the power of minus 36, or 10 to the power of minus 32, very, very short period, there was big inflation. This is what we believe. But Sir Roger Penrose has an alternative hypothesis, which is known as conformal cyclic cosmology. So the need for inflation is that the universe had to expand and become big, and it continues to expand. But the inflation was lots of expansion very early on to cover a lot of space. But what Sir Roger Penrose suggests is that there is no need for that, that each universe ends with a black hole that turns into radiation, that emits radiation, which is Hawking's radiation, or like light. So at the end, there is light. And then the light condenses or emerges again and starts a new universe. So that the universe starts and ends. This is very interesting to me. And the reason is, as a photobiologist, I know that light carries information. So when a plant is growing, a plant can tell which direction the light is coming from, the color of the light, and the duration of the light. So when I say information, I mean impact of some physical thing on another living physical thing that then adapts its growth and its response or its development to this information. So plants grow seasonally and start to change how they grow based on this light. And light is coming all the way across the universe. So, uh, what if, and this is the big if that is in my theory, what if there is another signal like light that we are unable to detect, and we can detect it, we can perceive it, because everything that we know and perceive is through our senses, and our senses only perceive a small, very small bit of the universe. So what if there is other information like light? So let's go with this for a second. And now if we say that this information is present in the smallest speck of the universe, of the space, of space time, and the smallest speck or the smallest pixel of space time was described by Max Planck, and it's 10 to power minus 35 meters. It's very tiny, very tiny. It's like in a picture, one can imagine when you print a picture,
Hmm.
it's actually tiny pixels that
Yeah.
add up the image. And so that's how our universe is constructed. We know that there is space time. Einstein told us space time is there, and it's a physical thing, and it actually can bend. So if that small pixel carries this information that I'm talking about, then now, as a biologist, I move a little bit away from mathematics because I'm not too good at it. I do biology, so I think about functions. So let's
Yeah.
say that this space-time, its function is to take any form. It has the ability to take physical or any form. And so almost like a stem cell. So a stem cell can become any cell in our body. It can make arms, it can make blood, but as it commits to becoming something, it can no longer go back to being a stem cell. So it's committed to taking a form. So same way, if that pixel is committed to taking a form, and slowly either it becomes a rock, or it becomes the sun or a planet, or a living animal, that means this information is fundamental,
Yeah.
and it has the ability to take any form. Now, once it starts to take that form, it gets bound or constrained by its own properties,
Hmm.
as the and its properties are accumulative, right? So if you're if you're with me so far, we're going to take this now a step further. So I call this smallest pixel of space a spoton. So it's a spot of space. So now if we take a photon will have many spotons, because a spoton is smaller than the photon even.
Hmm.
Now, photon doesn't have mass. When it's traveling, it's the fastest thing that travels in the universe.
Right.
To experience time, you need mass, because time is about mass and frequency. Time is measured by things going up and down, and we measure the duration of time with the clock. So photon actually does not experience any time. For a photon, um, even a photon that left billions of light years ago from a galaxy and arrives here and we detect it, for the photon those things happen instantaneously.
Wow.
So we move in the universe in a very different way. So let me give you a theoretical example. When you walk up into a room and it's dark and you turn your flashlight on, what happens?
Brightens the room.
Brightens the room. You walk into a bright room, right? It's because the photons are moving much faster than you are.
Yeah.
If the photons were moving slower than you will not walk into a bright room. The light will be always behind you. If you could run faster, like if you were Bolt, right? The fastest runner, the
Yeah.
won all these gold medals, right? Even he cannot outrun a photon, because photon is the
Right.
fastest thing. Now, here's a mind boggling thing. This is where I came up with this theory. So, if you take this photon, and in 1 second, this photon is going to travel 2.98 meters into 10 to 2.98 into 10 to power of 8 meters per second. That's the fastest speed in the universe, which means that in 1 second, it will be so far. I mean, it takes 8 minutes for light to travel from the sun to Earth. So when we see the light, when we look at the sun, we are seeing what it was 8 minutes, what was 8 minutes before, right? So there's an 8 minute lag, but that it takes only 8 minutes for the photon to travel this far. So if we think about this space now, the spot on, photon, well, the spot on has its own certain characteristics and properties, and it's constituting or making this photon. And photon has its own physical properties. So let's say now that any form has its physical properties and non-physical. I call it non-physical because we haven't been able to measure it yet.
Yeah.
So there is physical and non-physical properties. And today we sit here with huge problems in aligning quantum mechanics and general relativity. So at the micro scale, things are very random. We cannot
Right.
predict what's going to happen. At macro scale, we are much better in doing mathematics and calculating. And so the conversation we just had with Bruce McIver earlier was just about that somehow the quantum randomness renders itself, collapses, or takes some information and gives us the ability to, okay, here I am, this is what's happening, so that some randomness converts into some actual experience.
Yeah.
So we won't get into that, but I think one of the important things to remember is that in the photon, the properties are physical and non-physical, which is this information,
Mm. Okay.
and there is space inside the photon. I think we have missed that in our mathematics, in all our models. We have missed that there is space inside forms, and that space also have characteristics. If you go back to early, like Vedas or many ancient cultures, they said we are made out of five things, right? You may have heard of this. What are
I
the
don't
five
know.
things?
Yeah.
Fire, earth, water, air, and space. And we can do mathematics and measure and do everything about the other four. We don't know anything about the fifth one. So now, to solve this problem of what I said, how the photon is traveling much faster than us, if space has this property, then there is intrinsic space, which means that there is space inside a form, and then there is space outside.
Yeah.
And if it's space that contains those spot ons that has information that can take any form, we are at every moment, intrinsic space and the form that I am, for example, is is metamorphing or changing at every moment
Yes.
based on my encounter with the environment, with what's outside.
Hmm.
So as you walk into the lit room, your experience is different than if you were walking into the dark room.
Yeah.
Now, the photon has experienced so much more spatial information than you have because it traveled so much farther.
Right.
Right? So it hit, if here in San Francisco, I don't know what 2.98 into 10 to power 8 meters from my places, but let's say it hit a tree in a forest in 1 second, somewhere, some other country, other
Yeah.
continent in 1 second. During this movement, it encountered so much more spatial information. And so in my definition of consciousness is the degree of the ability to interrelate with the extrinsic information,
Okay.
right? So it basically boils it down to that our ability to interrelate with spatial information. So now you asked about the universe, and so that means that this information is possibly maybe belongs to even a previous universe. As I mentioned, according to Sir Roger Penrose, that radiation can carry information, and then it can take form. And then now let's take it a step further if you want to.
Yeah. Let's do it.
So on this planet, on earth, when these spot-ons and everything is happening, and the earth has some physical properties of itself,
Hmm.
nutrients, the temperature, the water. For example, for plants we need nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, we need carbon dioxide, and so all these conditions.
Yeah.
So if the spot on can take any form, then based on the conditions that are present on the planet, it's going to start taking forms that are more appropriate for that. So let's say that the very first cell appeared, right? And now that what's the difference between the first living cell and a rock? Well, the rock is subjected to its environment. it is subjected to it, and so it doesn't have the tools, it doesn't have the abilities to pre-see what may happen and react to the environment, whereas a living cell is reactive to the environment. And not only that, it can interact with the environment and utilize its environmental resources to grow, develop, and multiply. And so that's a big change. So then, the like I said, the consciousness is the degree of the ability to interrelate with your environment. So is rock conscious? Well, rock is made from all the spot ons.
Yeah.
So inherently, it has the ability to be conscious, but it doesn't have the tools to interact or interrelate with the environment, right? So when the cell becomes conscious, it starts to develop better, more proteins and uh, all these things on the membranes to sense the environment and then react to it. Now, what one interesting thing, which completely amazing to me, and as a biologist, that always perplexed me, that development is actually occurring at that spatial, very small pixel level. So as my nose is growing,
Hmm.
all that space is coordinated to make this nose
Right.
out in this external space, right? So a living being, somehow some space has decided to coordinate its development and make all these different pieces that take one form. So now within this form, if we are made out of all these spot-ons, now as a biologist again, atoms make molecules.
Yeah.
So all the spot-ons, I call it spoticule. So in any form, all the properties of the spot-on, which is non this information, together in any form will make a spoticule. Let's say it's like a cloud of space, or some information
Got.
that's inside.
Okay.
And so as a living form is developing, it's going to accumulate information, just like we accumulate memory. If you have an injury, your skin has a mark, so it's going to accumulate memories of everything that happens. So each spoticule is going to be unique, right? A spoticule of a photon will be different from a spoticule of a cow, will be different from of a plant. So the very first cell also had this spoticule. And so what that's one thing that fascinates me, that how space coordinates itself to take a form. The other interesting thing is the earth came into existence about 4.5 billion years ago. The first evidence for life that we have is 3.8 billion years ago. So it took less than 1 billion years for life to appear on earth.
Yeah.
And then we think that about 1.6 billion years ago, the plants and animals started to develop in different directions. And just to give a perspective, dinosaurs went extinct 65 million years ago. We are talking
Right.
about 1.6 billion years ago.
Yes.
So we are a tiny speck. How long we've been on the planet? Very tiny speck. So what's interesting is then, if the plants and animals split 1.6 billion years ago, there must be a common ancestor.
Right.
There must be one common ancestor, which is probably a eukaryote, which means multicellular. And then the plants started to develop, utilize light, and started to they took on a prokaryote, a cyanobacteria, and made chloroplast.
To
uh, and the
photosynthesize.
chloroplast started photosynthesis, and so they started fixing food. And how do they fix food? They take light, they take six molecules of water and six molecules of carbon dioxide, and the light energy combines the six molecules of water and six molecules of carbon dioxide to make real sugar that we can bite into.
Right.
Light, water, air turns into sugar that we can hold and weigh and eat, and the whole planet lives on it. Isn't that magic? So plants have that magic. So plants exceeded, or excelled in utilizing this light information that we were talking about and converting it into sugar.
Yeah.
And as the food problem was taken care of, animals started to develop slightly differently. I think animals started to utilize this other, excelled in utilizing this other information that we were talking about. And we won't get into this in this podcast, but I can draw direct links to this information and the effects of psychedelics and alternation of minds and all of those things. So There are biochemical pathways that I think are fit directly into this. So we can actually come up with experiments that we can test this.
Interesting.
So I think animals start to utilize this other information and excelled in it and develop better tools to use this other information, like
Mhm.
the neuronal networks and things like that.
Right.
And so got all these tools to interact and become aware. And so we think we are the only ones that are conscious. That depends on how we define consciousness.
Right.
If consciousness is the degree of the ability to interrelate with your environment, then it can go all the way back to the first cell or into even space,
Mhm.
right? So
Yeah, I see that. I see
consciousness
that.
consciousness is a process, just like photosynthesis is a process. The product of photosynthesis is sugars or food, and product of consciousness is thoughts and the ability to plan. And you know so as plants are producing food for themselves and us, I think if we are conscious beings, we should save the planet, not just for ourselves but also for plants.
Yes. It kind of sounds um like a way to describe it is that consciousness is the product itself for us.
Yes, it is. It is. So just like, if you ask the question, what is photosynthesis? Photosynthesis is the product of development of plants, led to it. So same way consciousness is itself in that way a product. But then down the stream of consciousness is thoughts and thinking and planning. We can plan our next vacation into UK or next year, right? Plants
Right.
don't really bother about that, or maybe they do. I don't know. but so that's the hypothesis. So I call this the theory of spatial relativity,
Gotcha.
because I think the experience of space, whether it's intrinsic inside a form or extrinsic, experiences information in different ways. So the experience of information is relative based on whether the space itself is constrained by certain properties or it's
Mhm.
unconstrained.
So trying to picture it for myself, this the spot on and the spoticule basically describes the space.
Right.
Yes. So
And containing the information
mhm.
and properties. Yeah.
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 And space actually creates shapes. Like that's
Right.
something that I think we don't when you're in a room, yes there's walls, but the room is also defined by the fact that there's space
Hmm.
creating the room. It's not just the walls. And that's kind of like applying that to just how your body works in a different way. I can see how that connection is made, like consciousness.
Yes, space is a building block
Hmm.
for any form.
Yes.
uh, we occupy space, but space also occupies us.
Yes.
It's sort of like a right.
That is, it's almost trippy to think about, but very, very interesting at the same time.
Yeah. So and like I was saying, that there are chemical pathways that we can tap into to relate how all of this may come together, and how even psychedelics work, how
Right.
anesthesia works. So those are the things that we're trying to design experiments for, and to show that consciousness is simply our ability. It's a signal transduction mechanism, how a signal that's outside is perceived and transduced and travels through and makes us react to the environment.
So I kind of have a question. Might be a little bit wide, but I'm wondering because as the conversation of consciousness develops and I learn more about it, it seems almost like there's multiple different things going on that are being described under the same word of consciousness. Because in
Yes.
the science like technical term, it's like either you're awake or asleep in a very
Mhm.
basic way of describing it. And that's very easy for people to understand. But then it's also used for more of the philosophical aspect of how aware you are of yourself and your surroundings and your surroundings, environment, and all of that, versus the unconscious thoughts that you're just kind of reacting rather than consciously making decisions and such. And I'm almost wondering if there need like do you think there could possibly be a better way to just like differentiate these types of consciousness?
Yes, I'm glad you asked that question. So, because you're absolutely right, consciousness term itself has so many different meanings. So
Yes.
I had to, and this is only, to make it clear in my own mind because
Hmm.
of the way I was thinking about it. So I had to, come up with another term for this information that I'm talking about, which is the information which is in a spot on, right? So this information I call it Aleph, and
Ah.
the reason I call it Aleph is because that's the very first letter of the very first language, Abadajad and also Sanskrit. So it's the very first letter. And it was available. And it has a symbol as well. So it worked really well. So I separate information, which is cosmos, the cosmos has. So if somebody says consciousness in space, I would say that's the information, that's Aleph.
Mm.
So now separating it from what is consciousness, so I would say a consciousness, like I've been saying, is the ability of the developed physical form to interrelate with the inherent information in varied degrees of self-awareness, right? So it's the inherent ability for us to interrelate with the information, which is Aleph, in degrees of self-awareness. So as we become more and more so I define consciousness that way. But then what is the physical form? A physical form in that sense will be a functional coordination of cumulated microspace, right? So all the spotons coming together is a functional coordination of all this microspace, but it's constrained by in performance by its own physical properties. So it's microspace coming together, but constraining its function by its own physical properties. So now I think you're absolutely right. We need to start to redefine the terms. But do we redefine them based on my theory? Well, that depends on if my theory is correct.
Right, right. I think the main difference is there's the spiritual way of seeing it versus the scientific, and that's the two sides that I think
It is,
use the same
that
term that
was
like yeah,
one of the drivers for me to expand the
yeah.
information this way, because I'm a scientist, and I think we've been doing science, and really good science, for the past 50 years. Our science has become better, the tools have become better,
Mhm.
but we've been living on the planet for much longer,
Yeah.
and there have been these cultures who've been describing their experiences, and it's why should scientists negate or say that's not correct, only we are correct? I think we need to start to think and incorporate some of those experiences and writings and literature into our science. And when we define our questions and start to design experiments, if we don't include that, we may be only looking at one piece of something. So
Mhm.
this is why I expanded the explanation much broadly, because it does fit the spirituality part. So in that
Yeah,
sense,
yeah.
being spiritual is becoming more and more self-aware. Real like a realized person will have maximum sensitivity to their environment,
Right.
and they will never be depressed, because they realize that their experience is unique to them. Nothing outside is going to impact them or make them sad, because they're utilizing the form to experience the world, right? So it does connect with spirituality as well.
Yeah. I think maybe what it is that catches me when I think about it is just that how are able to conceptualize things is based on language. So our only real understandings of things is what we understand of a certain term. So
Right.
it's kind of like you have to broaden those understandings before it makes sense.
Very important. Language restricts,
Yeah.
and also language actually can be the cause for miscommunication,
Oh, totally.
right? And
See it
so,
all the
yes,
time.
so no, language is also our own construct. So I would say that any things that we construct are going to be limited by our own abilities to perceive things, and we are acting on a working bench with certain tools and techniques, and those tools and techniques are limited by what we know and what we can access.
Right. And
Right.
I guess the same could be argued for say plants. Like
Yeah,
they're very within their own realm of abilities to
right.
communicate. So,
Well, one thing we forget is that we, Homo sapiens, are one species. When we look at plants or animals, there are many more species. So like you just said, they work in their own realm or their own situations, but each species, we distinguish species by characteristics, genetic or a physiological or whatever. We say, well, this is so different, this is its own species. And so that's right. So what you just said is so important, because each of those species may have completely different experience and different ways to deal with the environment, which we know it does. Different plants flower different times, grow in different conditions, the areas. It's just our of us humans. We broke through the limitations of our regional dependency, and we developed tools and technologies to get ourselves out of that dependency, and we can now live anywhere. But then somewhere we got lost, and we start to think about, how can I make myself better, my my self experience better. And we have there are good things about it. I mean, we improved our lifestyles tremendously.
Right.
We are much more comfortable now, healthier. But I think now it's time to start to think back and see what resources we are using, how are we acting, and are we being aware? If so, spiritual beings need less. As right, as you become more and more spiritual, you need less and less and less, because your experience starts to become bigger and bigger. There is such an amazing transition there, and that's all linked to consciousness. So yeah, you're right, but we should remember that we are just one species. There are many more species on the planet.
That's very an interesting way to look at it. So, going back real quick to how we were talking about there's different levels or types of consciousness, it reminded me a lot about the Michael Pollan book. I actually have it right here. This is Your Mind on Plants, where he talked about his experience on different substances such as caffeine, mescaline. And with the mescaline one, it reminded me specifically about what we were talking earlier, and also the Bruce McIver episode, because he discussed how this like mindful expansion when he's experiencing so many different stimuluses, and it's like eye-opening, right? But at the
Mm-hmm.
same time, it's overwhelming in a way.
Hmm.
At least that's how it sounded in my reading of it, because I haven't experienced that. But to the point where the things that mattered on a day-to-day basis, work and moving and engaging in things and achieving things, and all this different pressures that we have in our society and our cultures now, that they don't matter in the same way, where your experiences are so more opened, and you're more in tune with your environment. And
Hmm.
when I think about that, is it's almost scary in a sense, because I think of how that might impact the survival, right? Because if we're not as pushing for, achievement or getting things done, or, you know, what our species kind of tends to do in all this like activity way, how is that it's amazing that our brains can expand more in engaging awareness feeling. But is it good? Like, is that kind of scary in the fact of it's not good for survival?
That's a very good question, and it's a common way to describe why we sort of developed more physically, in terms of, like you're saying, having more physical experiences, and lost maybe that experience of the whole worldliness, or whatever that is, like
Right.
being more connected, right? So, and I've seen many cartoons being drawn where there's actually Sir Roger Penrose showed one at the conference that I was at the Science of Consciousness, where there's like a caveman, and he's sitting down and drawing all these amazing things about thinking about spirituality, and there's like a big lion behind him and an elephant. They come and eat him because he's not paying any attention to creating like a barricade. And so yeah, so survival. So we can picture this, that there were the human beings that were at that early stages, were interacting with the immediate environment and trying to survive. They didn't have the time, or were selected out compared to the humans that were being more physically and feeding themselves better and making barricades, and right. So that there is something to that process. I will tell you about another hypothesis, which is very interesting. It's put forward by Dennis McKenna, who will be one of our guests as well, and I hope we'll hopefully have Michael Pollan on as well. So Dennis McKenna has another hypothesis, which is the stoned ape theory, and it's people hear it and chuckle about it, but his he and Dennis McKenna, his brother, they came up with the hypothesis that when these apes were walking around in jungles, they were eating mushrooms, and that gave them this fulfillment and developed their brains to be able to do agriculture. So we have both sides, right? On one side we have this theory where, okay, survival was so important, and so we stopped doing those things. On the other side, well, we were surviving, but only we became more conscious only because the apes had access to psychedelic mushrooms. So those are the two different types of theories, and which one is correct? I think we need to do science. There's not enough data or experiments, and these things are hard to ask direct questions.
Yeah.
But
And
ultimately,
sorry,
yeah,
sorry. Michael Pollan also talked about how caffeine and the Industrial Revolution spurred a lot of more engagement, and I don't know how to describe it, but how just that correlation of this stimulant
absolutely,
that,
yeah. I mean,
changes the culture.
I agree with Michael Pollan completely. We think we are in control. We are not. Plants
Yeah,
are in control.
I don't think so too.
Right? I mean, what a great way to survive, to get all the humans to start growing maize and whatever, soybeans and all these plants everywhere. So plants cover more space than we do in terms of agriculture and forest,
Hmm.
and then they get us to plant them everywhere. So it depends on how we look at things. So this
Right.
is why ultimately your question is very important, because I think at the very root of it, we need to realize that we have the ability, that there's no lion chasing me today. I'm not, I'm doing just fine surviving.
Hmm.
So we can go with whatever these theories, but there is so much depression, and especially with COVID, people are suffering. And I think if we just look inside ourselves and realize that we are actually conscious machines, and we have such abilities to detach ourselves from pain and suffering at any moment, and realize that we have abilities that we can do so many amazing things. Of course, it's not always possible, right?
Right.
There
And I
somebody
think
is.
the important key there is also it reading that and trying to understand how those experiences work. The influence of plants such as mescaline does allow that expanding or that changing of your perceptions and stimulus and stuff. But there's also the level of you can connect with that to an extent without the use of
Yes,
certain plants to
to
get there.
meditation.
And that's kind of also, at least personally, that's what interests me because we've all experienced downtimes and how you handle them and are able to understand your own thoughts and feelings and the world around you, environment, and perceive things differently like pain or hardships without the use of um,
Yeah,
plants can
and
also be part of that expanding of your own consciousness.
right. So because ultimately it's biochemical, so that's why we'll need a whole different podcast to talk about that. Psychedelics work through biochemistry, and ultimately, to make it very simple and quick for now, there is a molecule called dimethyltryptamine, DMT, which our bodies make, but it break down it very quickly. And we'll talk. I'm sure we will talk more about that with Dennis McKenna as well.
Yeah.
So, but DMT is very common in all the psychedelics that you're mentioning, and our bodies make it too. So when we meditate, or when we are like downtime, in what you call downtime, the ability to kind of people talk about that you have to shut everything off. You don't have to shut everything off. Your heart is beating, everything is going, your brain is working. What you need to do is start to focus inwards, think about yourself, and you will notice that things will start to emerge that you need to deal with. And that happens even when you're sleeping. Many times you go to bed with questions, and in the morning, I know how to solve that problem, right? So because these processes are going on, and I would like to, whoever is listening to this, would like to point them to Sadhguru and Isha Foundation. I mean, I learned when I was doing all this and doing my science and trying to put these concepts together, I felt like what he talks about has direct connections to how I'm doing my research as well, because he has this inner engineering program, and he teaches teaches. He's an amazing yoga teacher. In many
Yeah.
ways, he describes things. So I think reaching to that connectivity between inside you is how to get out of depression, how to get out of things. But you can use chemicals, but the chemicals are just, they're not going to have long lasting effect.
Right.
They may have, I mean, in a way they will have long lasting effect, but it's not inherent. It hasn't become inherent. You're still going, if somebody's using psilocybin to feel that way all the time, then you may have some trips, and maybe slowly you'll realize that, okay, now I can do it myself as well. But you're right, you don't need that
Hmm.
to experience what we're talking about.
Yeah, yeah. And I think what you were explaining with like meditation, I have very like minimal experience with that even. But like from what I have experienced is it's more of a tuning in than tuning out. And I think when
Mhm.
I was growing up, that was like the biggest part that I didn't understand. I
Yeah.
did a lot. My mom was a yoga instructor, and we would always be at the Buddhist temple. And I was around a lot of meditation and all of these great things. But I just, anytime somebody would try to, talk me through it or something, my brain would be like, no,
Yeah.
I'm not gonna zone out because I just did not have that like understanding of it's just a changing of where you are focusing your attention. It's actually
Right. Right.
more attention, more focused attention rather than
Inward. Right.
um, just mindless thought almost.
Right. Right. Yeah.
And that
Yeah.
is in itself kind of a relieving of whatever issues there are because you
Mhm.
realize different interpretations of what's around you and your situations and such.
Right. Yeah. And that's, and there is research going on with, when people are meditating, what's going on chemically, and even electrophysiologically. We will have another guest, Jay Sanguinity. We will invite him. He's doing amazing work. He's using ultrasound, and he's found spots in the brain where, when he shines ultrasound, he's gotten similar results electrophysiologically, that are similar to people who have been meditating for years.
Wow.
So you can induce meditative states by activating certain parts of the brain.
That's
Yeah, we will have him as a guest as well. So yeah, there is something clearly going on here, and so our biochemistry is not just our own, it's inside, it's all the time responding, reacting to the environment and things that are going on outside, and also perceptions of things that we take in inside. So we are complex beings, and such are plants, so are plants. Good. Well, that was a good discussion. Hopefully everyone enjoyed it, and thanks for joining us.
yes. Thank you so much. Please like and subscribe and share this podcast with anybody that you think would also be interested. And we'll see you in the next one.